A sentient being is a being that has capacities for sensation. That's a very general definition. A more specific definition that a lot of people use is that sentience is the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, and more specifically the capacity to suffer. And for a lot of people, they really hang their hat on that the capacity to suffer is sort of definitive of what it means to be a sentient being. I try to broaden it a little bit in my work and say that there aren't really beings that are only capable of experiencing pleasure and pain, or only capable of suffering. That capacity to experience pleasure and pain is always part of a larger ensemble of capacities that ultimately involve consciousness or subjective awareness. And then it becomes very difficult to define exactly what subjective awareness means. But a very nice, if approximate definition that I really like comes from a philosopher named Thomas Nagel, who wrote a famous essay called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" And the answer to that question is we can't really know what it's like to be a bat, because their perceptual encounter with the world through echolocation and so forth is so different than ours that it's not really quite the same. But we can rest satisfied that there's something that it's like to be a bat. And that is the sort of hook that Nagel uses, that beings that are conscious are beings for whom there's something that it's like to be that being. And he never gets beyond that formulation, but I think it's a useful, at least, route into this question of sentience, that sentient beings are beings that care about the world, that care about their lives, that can fare well or ill, even if they can't step back and think discursively or abstractly about what it means for life to mean something, or what their life exactly means to them. Anybody who has had a meaningful interaction with a companion animal knows exactly what this is all about, that life means something to them. They have desires, they have preferences, they have things they like, they have things they don't like. They have tempers, they have moods. And I think these are all part of, for me, the broad conception of sentience that I work with, which is, yes, they can suffer, but I don't think we should focus just on suffering, because then you have these funky arguments to the effect that, well, if we can do things to them without making them suffer, then it's okay. But really it's about abrogating or limiting their freedom in a way that if they could tell us they didn't approve of it, they'd tell us they didn't approve of it. And it's why, for instance, there's such a problem with domesticated animals, especially animals in experimentation and research, animals being used for field labor and things like that, those are all sentient creatures. So then the borderline cases are things like, okay, now what about bivalves, oysters and clams? I can't prove it, but my understanding is, from what I've read, oysters don't have central nervous systems. They don't have these things called nociceptors, which are pain receptors. And if they don't have nociceptors, it seems impossible that they can experience pain, unless their morphology, the structure of their bodies, is so different that there's some totally other way in which they could feel pain, which we can't exclude as a possibility. But it seems like they're not sentient creatures. Whereas certainly animals that we think of as being a lot more like us are sentient creatures. You know, reptiles are sentient, and mammals are sentient, and birds are sentient. At least many, many of them are. And so we were talking before about the question of whether nature can have some sort of a moral value, and people often ask me the question, well, why do you focus just on animals? What about plants? It's now become a big question. Should there be something like plant ethics or something like that? And my answer is, I do leave open the possibility that we could have moral obligations toward non-sentient life, like trees or ecosystems, a la Aldo Leopold in a Sand County Almanac. But it strikes me that sentient beings can be harmed in ways in which non-sentient beings can't be harmed, namely because they can suffer, because they can experience pain, because they can be frustrated in their subjective, conscious endeavors to make something out of their lives. So that in a nutshell is what sentience is about and why it's important.